going back. I'd also point out Pakistan's origins, carved out of India and the colonial past of India. It's a big transition. But let me say one thing about the old Helsinki, because I actually went back and looked at what the tenets of whether it was unpopular or not. 3 tenets: inviolability of European frontiers, reject the use of force or intervention in internal affairs, and respect human rights. Well, I don't think that framework is so bad, by the way. And it actually was sort of kind of observed for a while. I just want to make one point, and then I will answer your question, Daniel. In 2014, I was on the Maidan observing what had happened, but also as part of an observer delegation for the upcoming election, the one Petro Poroshenko won. And that observer delegation was chaired by the late, great Madeleine Albright. It was part of the National Democratic Institute program of observing delegations, which I have done over many, many years, including before, during, and after my congressional career. But at any rate, there we were, and I was heading the Wilson Center at the time, and one of our scholars was a man named Wolfgang Ischinger. You probably all know who he is. He was the German ambassador to the U.S. for a time. He's, until recently been, or until 10 minutes ago, the CEO of the Munich Security Conference, which is an extraordinary event held a month from now every year. And Wolfgang was at the Wilson Center, and I go off to Ukraine, and all of a sudden I hear he's taken a leave of absence. Well, he'd only been at the Wilson Center for a few months. Where was he? He was on an OSCE delegation setting up listening tables around Ukraine so that people could be informed about the election. It sounds like a good idea for every election, and participate in the vote. Well, we all remember, or it's still true, I guess, the OSCE is a consensus organization. Russia is a member of the organization. He was in Ukraine at the invitation of the OSCE. Russia, at that point already, was destabilizing some of the towns in the Donbass. But the election was conducted. It was a fair and free election, and imperfect as it was, that was in the recent past. So I just put that out there to contemplate. Yes, the world is different, and yes, Russia has violated every single tenet of the Helsinki Accords. But when we come back to this, I just want to put out there that maybe there's no way to go back, but if we go forward, those tenets still seem pretty good to me. On U.S.-China, I think we're going to talk a lot about Ukraine, but I think China is watching carefully, very carefully, what happens in Ukraine. And I think it is plausible, everyone discusses this, that China will model what action it takes on Taiwan based on what it thinks the rest of the world was ready to do, did do, will do in Ukraine. And I personally think that the stronger we are in Ukraine, the less likely it is that China will move into Taiwan. And I would put a few more things on the table now for future discussion. One is that China's economy ain't great. 2 is that the COVID policy has failed in China. 3 is that China even announced that there is a negative birth rate now. And by the way, India's population will exceed China's in this decade. And so I think China has a lot of homework to do to keep their country going, and starting another unprovoked illegal war doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Let me stick with you for one more backward-looking question. You mentioned those tenets; they seem pretty acceptable, pretty hard to argue with. When we look back at the history of the post-Cold War, what did we get wrong? How did that framework become questioned or controversial? What were the mistakes?
Well, I actually wrote a book last year about this, and called Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to to address hard national security problems makes us less safe. And my theory is that we got it right in 1945, given what the world was like, and we also were magnanimous to those we defeated. Segue to the end of the Cold War, and the West's behavior in the Cold War, I think, was very impressive. The Cold War ends, and in my view, an act of hubris, we decide, or the U.S. decides, we won, everyone else lost, everyone wants to be us. and we ignored the rise of three huge factors in the 90s. One was the rise of China, which did not want to be us, had a very separate economic view, and we missed the rise of China. Two was the rise of terrorism, a whole bunch of folks who wanted to basically take us out. And three was the rise of Russian grievance, which has a longer history, but more specifically, the things that Putin's talking about, you could argue started when Russia was treated, whatever the word is, magnanimously after the Cold War ended. And so I think that we are paying in spades for three huge mistakes.
I want to go back to you, Minister Zardari, to talk a bit about Ukraine. It has understandably been a huge part of conversations here this week. You know the narrative about both the causes of the war, the fault in the war, and the consequences of the war in Europe and the United States. You have a somewhat different view on it. Tell us what the war looks like from where you sit.
Look, I think as far as support for international law, for the United Nations, for UN Security Council resolutions, I think I have a very similar view to everybody sitting on the stage. As far as the human tragedy, the humanitarian crisis, the loss of life, I think we all share exactly the same view. As far as the economic consequences or the knock-on ripple effects of this colossal tragedy has had not only in Europe, but not only in the West, but all over the world. Gas prices have gone up in America, but they've also gone up in Pakistan. We've had food security, energy insecurity issues. I think the perspective that we come to, particularly from the South perspective, is that we don't see the Ukraine conflict as the first and only time that international law and the United Nations Security Council resolutions have been violated. We find it ironic that the UN applies in Ukraine, but not in Iraq. We find it sad that the United Nations Security Council resolutions that mean so much to all of Europe and all of the West right now mean nothing more than the paper that they're written on when it comes to the case of Kashmir. So I think that from that aspect, our perspectives are different. As a country that just we were part of the last forever war. Our hope, our prayer is that this does not turn into the next forever war. So perhaps more so than those who were directly involved in this conflict, we hope that it is resolved sooner rather than later. We'd like to see a proactive approach from both sides to also pursue diplomacy in the pursuit of peace, while absolutely having to respond to the military elements of this conflict. I believe that diplomacy is the key thing that is missing. And what I would say to my Ukrainian friends would be that, NATO was in my neighborhood too. And we thought that they would be there till the last terrorist, and until that war was concluded, and ultimately that conflict was resolved around a negotiating table. I feel we wasted much time because back in 2002, the Afghan Taliban were willing to surrender and negotiate, but we did not take that opportunity seriously and ended up having to do the same thing in 2022. I hope that eventually the space is created for some sort of dialogue and diplomatic engagement in order to resolve the conflict.
Mr. Fayon, I'd like you to respond to that, but also to give your sense of what's at stake in Ukraine as you see it.
I can say that I, in a way, very much agree that there is a lot of hypocrisy around the globe, what basically the minister from Pakistan was saying between the lines. And also, when you said, I perfectly agree that we don't need Eurocentric debates, because every conflict, such a war that we have on the European continent, is globally today affecting everyone. Just look to the energy insecurity, food insecurity, high prices, the consequences that mostly the poorest parts of the world are today facing. And that is why I say violating the rules or international order or Helsinki Final Act, or it's extremely important that we really focus on, because we have nothing else and nothing can be above these rules and the law. And we cannot be changing it when at a time there are regimes, national states or interests breaking them. That goes the same when you put the question on Helsinki. I don't think there is a time now to discuss about the changing of security arrangements for Europe when we don't have a consensus how to deal with the rules. And yes, I think it's really important to have diplomacy, people diplomacy, and also to embrace Global South. When we discuss about the war in European continent, we shall never forget about other conflicts around the world. I also miss this week the debates here, and I can say there are some critical voices that forums as Davos can be successful only if they really manage to reduce inequalities around the globe, that they can manage to address what are the challenges globally, climate change, security threats, energy risks, poverty. Only then we will be successful when we talk to each other and not away from each other. And that is why it's important to have such dialogues, to understand what is happening around us. And again, I hope that forum can be a success if we manage to really make or improve our state of the world.
Mr. Rescue, would also like you to respond, but also to talk about how you see the stakes in Ukraine and what the outcome of this war will mean for both Europe and international order.
Well, I think when we discuss about diplomacy and the role of diplomacy in the context of the war in Ukraine, we have to be very much aware of the premises, because what is at the basis of the whole thing? When we approach this situation, we have to be very aware of the fact that there is a victim of aggression and an aggressor. This is the starting point of the whole discussion about peace, about diplomacy towards peace in Ukraine. And we have to be very clear about that. Ukraine is the victim of the aggression, and Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine has suffered territorial losses, which are the result of a breach, a serious breach of international law, of the principles of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of the inviolability of borders, which are all part of the Helsinki Final Act decalogue of fundamental principles of international law. And if we discuss about peace, we will start the discussions on peace in Ukraine when Ukraine will decide to start such peace negotiations, because it is about their territorial integrity. But it is about more than that. It is about the parameters of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, which were challenged by Russia. It is about the democratic values which are at the basis, at the very core of our community of values and security, the Euro-Atlantic community, which has, of course, a lot of implications and effects on the global south. And, of course, it is about the democratic values. So this is what it is at stake. So we are not just talking about two parties which are on the same footing, and they have to negotiate some peace in a sort of a neutral, isolated environment. It is connected to all these issues, and all these issues have an impact on all of us, on the international community as a whole. So I think that we can no longer afford any kind of variation of strategic ambiguity when we talk about the war in Ukraine, when we talk about the diplomacy efforts towards peace, and of course when we talk about the security architecture and the principles which are at the basis of the Helsinki Final Act. And these principles are still valid. And they are valid not only for the Euro-Atlantic community, but they are also valid for the Global South and for the whole world. Let's not forget the fact that the 1975 Helsinki Final Act fundamental principles of international law, in fact, were replicating the fundamental principles of international law which were included in a General Assembly resolution 2625 of 1970, which was called the Resolution for the Principles of International Law concerning the friendly relations and cooperation among states. That resolution included 7 principles. The Helsinki Final Act added 3 more. 2 of them, inviolability of borders and territorial integrity, were in fact resulting from the sovereignty, equal sovereignty principle. And then there it was added the respect for fundamental rights and human freedoms. So the whole architecture, which was built in 1975 in Helsinki, is still valid today. And it is valid not just for the Euro-Atlantic community, it's valid for the whole world. And the stake here now is to defend this architecture, because this means defending the core values on which our community is based on. It's not about building another architecture. It is about defending this architecture and perhaps creating more effective mechanisms in order to sanction those who are breaching in a serious manner, in an irresponsible manner, this set of parameters. I think this is where we are. And again, speaking about values, we cannot afford strategic ambiguity.
I want to turn in a moment to the forward-looking, constructive side of this, but Mr. Zardari, I'd also like you to respond to that interpretation.
I have
Is there anything you take issue with?
just simple questions. There are 2 ways to achieve your objective. Say your objective is every inch of territory back in the hands of the Ukrainian people. It's some sort of NATO Article 5. Is it not even worth trying to achieve those same objectives through dialogue? Surely you can achieve those objectives through war and through conflict, but you could try to achieve them around the negotiating table. What's the worst that could happen? You'd fail and go back to war. But if you do manage to reach a consensus that covers all your concerns, but addresses some of the anxieties that the opposing sides might have, surely that's worth trying. From a perspective of a country that honestly just went through 20 years of conflict, who personally, I was on the side of this isn't over until we defeat every single last extremist or terrorist, and then the way I saw those events ultimately unfold, I would always advise, and this is constructive, friendly advice from somebody who's on your side, that while I understand the seriousness, the gravity, the challenge to Europe, I mean, I studied in the British system. I mean, we all grew up learning about World War II and all the aftermath and how much that must mean for everybody within Europe. I fail to understand why we can't simultaneously have some serious, responsible international players also trying to pursue a diplomatic resolution to a conflict.
Minister Fayon?
Yeah, I just wish to continue on that point, because I fully agree it's surely worth trying to establish and continuously trying to establish conditions to start negotiations for peace. There is no doubt, and I perfectly agree that there shall be diplomatic channels open, because at the end of the day, you will have to have both sides at the negotiation table. You cannot make a peace arrangement without Russia at the table. But first you have to have conditions, so that means you have to stop the fights. And currently it doesn't look that there are conditions. But I mean, for Slovenia, we have in our constitution, we really would always argue for peace and a dialogue for peace. Now, at the end of the day, every peace agreement is basically done at the negotiation table. Just the question is how long does it take and how many victims and how big is the damage. We all know. So I also like to say that there is no winner at any war, but I'm afraid that we will go into a very long conflict, rather a frozen conflict that will damage a lot. And we should definitely continue with the efforts you mentioned.
All right, we've left 10 minutes. Do you want to?
Well, I would just agree more with our friend from Romania. And the reason I would is that I think whatever happens will end in negotiation. But there has to be some strength, enough strength on the Ukrainian West side to come up with a solution that is fair. And I've seen over the years no effort by Vladimir Putin to abide by any agreement he's ever made. And he's now torching Ukraine. He has no respect for human life or territory or food security for the world or anything. And so I don't think this is the right time to negotiate.
We have about 10 minutes to come up with a new security architecture for the world. So
easy.
We'll be crisp about this. But let me start as we turn to this forward-looking part. I think kind of zooming out a little bit to you, Minister Zardari. You talked about bringing the global South into a discussion of the international system, global rules. What would that change? What perspective would you bring that you think would change the basic tenets of the system?
Just quite frankly, I think the entire international order is constructed around the Western interests. And it was constructed at a time, a very sort of a sadder time in our history when colonialism was more of a reality. Many of the countries that exist today did not exist at the time the structure was set into place. I believe that the international order can only be empowered if were the inputs of Africa, Asia, China, India, the entire globe represented in this so-called order. And if you have the buy-in of everyone, then there's more of a chance of it to succeed. That everyone would also have to be those that you don't agree with. It would mean that we would have to compromise, others would have to compromise, but a truly successful system will be just that, a compromise that we could reach together.
Minister Fayon, let me go to you because you have endorsed this idea of bringing in, a new set of voices to the system. What to you would that change about the order and the system as it exists currently?
I was just thinking now when you say, can we compromise only with the existing rules we have in a political atmosphere or in a political setting without including big business and corporations that are working globally across the national borders and interests. So that really we have to look into this new reality we have today and also adapt with our rules to this new reality. But we have United Nations, and I strongly believe we have to reform United Nations. There is an ongoing discussion, but I think we have to put also more focus on regional organizations. I was recently attending a conference on multilateralism in Rome, and we were discussing how regional organizations should be more embraced, having global mechanisms, of course, but be better heard and understood, because they know better what is really going on. So the combination of everything, and I said before, as the title Helsinki, it's not a moment now, but we have to use full potential of what we are having, and really full potential of the organizations, of the rules, and being really aware that it's nothing about the law, that no one can go beyond that and destroy the international law and order, because what is then left? And this is really the risk we are all facing ahead of us. And in fact, this week, listening at least to the politicians, I was surprised in a way because I got a feeling that no one really knows exactly where we are heading and what the solutions can be. And that is why it's good we are listening each other and trying to understand all the challenges we are facing in different spheres of life.
And to you, bringing in the regional organizations would be a different way of organizing.
I think certainly we have to pay more attention on that.
Yes.
Mr. Rescue, let me go to you, and feel free to be global in this response, but I'd also like you to say a bit more about how you see European security architecture in, it's premature to talk about the wake of Ukraine, but as we think about what this might look like in the years ahead, what should change about that security architecture? What shouldn't change? What do you think, how do you think that'll play a role in the broader structure of international security?
Well, as I mentioned, I think for the time being, there is nothing wrong with the current parameters of the security architecture. I mean, only because a certain actor is attacking the current security architecture for its own reasons, which are not necessarily, and we know for sure in this case, because Russia is the aggressor, not only against Ukraine, but also against our security architecture. So it's clear that this attack is outside the current international rules-based order. So it doesn't mean that if someone attacks the rules, that means the rules should change only for that. It means that those rules and parameters should be defended. And then perhaps we can find, and we should find, more viable and effective mechanisms to defend, but not to change the parameters. The parameters are fine. I think the security architecture, as we have it right now, needs to be only reinforced in the terms of implementation of these rules and in terms of defending the rules against rogue actors, which are trying to simply undermine this and change things for their own private interests. This is one thing. Second, I don't think that a discussion on Helsinki, as Tanya said, a new Helsinki is ripe right now. Of course, in 2025, we will have the 50 years anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. Perhaps in the meantime, the war will be over, then we will have lessons learned from this crisis with all its layers, which are acting in parallel, and we had to cope with each one of them at the same time, and they are interrelated. So we can draw some lessons learned and then apply them. But it's too early to say what we are going to have in 2 years' time. In the meantime, what we have to do is to solve this problem, that we need perhaps more effective instruments to defend what we have, which again, it looks fine. Probably because it looks fine, it is attacked. So this is where we are.
Representative Harman, let me go to you to close, both with a global perspective, but also to, again, you're not representing the U.S. government, but talk a bit about what you think the U.S. role should be and whether the United States today, with all of our own domestic dysfunction and polarization with our own political system, whether the U.S. is up to the task.
In 2 minutes and 52 seconds.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, one sort of big comment that came from here, which was, I was at some event, and the Secretary General of the United Nations said that maybe we need a new San Francisco and maybe we need a new Bretton Woods. Those are huge statements, especially coming from a person in his job. And the UN was mentioned. I think having a UN structure that is not global north, or it isn't even global, north-centered, would be a huge sea change and might change the rest of it. And yes, it's the Security Council that needs to change.
वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम में सिक्योरिटी एंड कोऑर्डिनेशन पर मुकालमा जारी है। बिलावल भुट्टो जरदारी भी इज़हार ख्याल कर रहे हैं। यहाँ एक ब्रेक लेंगे।
जियो हेडलाइन न्यूज के लिए ताउन किया है
सेफगार्ड से नहाना,
जर्म दूर भगाना,